Hello and welcome to another episode of 2 Minutes with Tim here on Heavenward Thinking. Today I want to challenge you picking up where we left off last time in Ephesians chapter 5. We're going to skip down to verse 15 today. So I'll read it and we'll get right into today's challenge. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. These three verses are very short, but they're very powerful verses because they should be the guiding principle or the foundation of our lives. We, as Christians, as we've said many times on this show before, we're called to live differently. And that starts with our thinking, and that's clearly based on what Scripture says here because it tells us we need to be careful how we live, starting with being wise, not being unwise. So we got to start having a different thought process, and then that's going to carry out into our actions, into our day-to-day routine. And it says to make the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. And then the next verse tells us how we're to make the most of every opportunity. It says, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. So the antidote for the evil world we live in, the world full of foolishness, full of evil, full of chaos, full of darkness, that antidote for that is understanding what the Lord's will is. As Christians, we will not be effective in the world around us. We won't be able to do what the Lord has called us to do if we don't first know what God has called us to do. If we don't know what His will is in our lives, how can we be effective as instruments of His in our day-to-day lives? We will never be effective if we don't first understand what God's will is. And that takes time. It takes training, and specifically training in Scripture. We don't know what God's will is if we don't know what His Word is. The only way to know what God's will is to seek Him through prayer and through reading Scripture and meditating on it, memorizing it, understanding what God has called us to do comes first, understanding His Word. And so I want to encourage you this week to make sure you're living wise, not unwise, and to be making the most of your opportunities that God presents you with by first and foremost seeking after the Lord's will each and every day. Make sure you're really digging into Scripture, digging into what God has called you to do. Seek His will for your life and not your own, and watch and see how God will move in a mighty way in your life this week. As always, join us next time for another episode of 2 Minutes with Tim here on Heavenward Thinking.